Section 17 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 17. But Risha Warren Smith cried, walking down Harley Street, that she did not like that man. Shredding and slicing, dividing and subdividing, the clocks of Harley Street nibbled at the June day, counselled submission, upheld authority, and pointed out in chorus the supreme advantages of a sense of proportion, until the mound of time was so far diminished that a commercial clock, suspended above a shop in Oxford Street, announced, genially and fraternally, as if it were a pleasure to Messrs. Rigby and Lowndes to give the information gratis, that it was 1:30. Looking up, it appeared that each letter of their names stood for one of the hours. Subconsciously one was grateful to Rigby and Lowndes for giving one time ratified by Greenwich, and this gratitude, so Hugh Whitbread ruminated, dallying there in front of the shop window, naturally took the form later of buying off Rigby and Lowndes' socks or shoes. So he ruminated. It was his habit. He did not go deeply. He brushed surfaces, the dead languages, the living, life in Constantinople, Paris, Rome, riding, shooting, tennis it had been once. The malicious asserted that he now kept guard at Buckingham Palace, dressed in silk stockings and knee breeches, over what nobody knew. But he did it extremely efficiently. He had been afloat on the cream of English society for 55 years. He had known prime ministers. His affections were understood to be deep. And if it were true that he had not taken part in any of the great movements of the time, or held important office, one or two humble reforms stood to his credit. An improvement in public shelters was one, the protection of owls in Norfolk another. Servant girls had reason to be grateful to him, and his name at the end of letters to the Times, asking for funds, appealing to the public to protect, to preserve, to clear up litter, to abate smoke, and stamp out immorality in parks, commanded respect. A magnificent figure he cut, too, pausing for a moment, as the sound of the half-hour died away, to look critically, magisterially, at socks and shoes, impeccable, substantial, as if he beheld the world from a certain eminence and dressed to match, but realised the obligations which size, wealth, health entail, and observed punctiliously, even when not absolutely necessary, little courtesies, old-fashioned ceremonies which gave a quality to his manner, something to imitate, something to remember him by. For he would never lunch, for example, with Lady Bruton, whom he had known these 20 years, without bringing her in his outstretched hand a bunch of carnations and asking Miss Brush, Lady Bruton's secretary, after her brother in South Africa, which, for some reason, Miss Brush, deficient though she was in every attribute of female charm, so much resented that she said, "Thank you, he's doing very well in South Africa," when for 6 years he had been doing badly in Portsmouth. Lady Bruton herself preferred Richard Dalloway, who arrived at the next moment. Indeed, they met on the doorstep. Lady Bruton preferred Richard Dalloway, of course. He was made of much finer material, but she wouldn't let them run down her poor dear Hugh. She could never forget his kindness. He had been really remarkably kind. She forgot precisely upon what occasion, but he had been remarkably kind. Anyhow, the difference between one man and another does not amount to much. She had never seen the sense of cutting people up, as Clarissa Dalloway did, cutting them up and sticking them together again, not at any rate when one was 62. She took Hugh's carnations with her angular grim smile. There was nobody else coming, she said. She had got them there on false pretences, to help her out of a difficulty. "But let us eat first," she said. And so there began a soundless and exquisite passing to and fro through swing doors of aproned, white-capped maids, handmaidens not of necessity, but adepts in a mystery or grand deception practised by hostesses in Mayfair, from 1:30 to 2, when, with a wave of the hand, the traffic ceases, and there rises instead this profound illusion, in the first place about the food, how it is not paid for, and then that the table spreads itself voluntarily with glass and silver, little mats, saucers of red fruit, films of brown cream masked turbot, in casseroles severed chickens swim, coloured, undomestic the fire burns, and with the wine and the coffee, not paid for, rise jocund visions before musing eyes, gently speculative eyes, eyes to whom life appears musical, mysterious, eyes now kindled to observe genially the beauty of the red carnations which Lady Bruton, whose movements were always angular, had laid beside her plate, so that Hugh Whitbread, feeling at peace with the entire universe and at the same time completely sure of his standing, said, resting his fork, "Wouldn't they look charming against your lace?" Miss Brush resented this familiarity intensely. She thought him an underbred fellow. She made Lady Bruton laugh. Lady Bruton raised the carnations, holding them rather stiffly with much the same attitude with which the General held the scroll in the picture behind her. She remained fixed, tranced. Which was she now? The General's great-granddaughter? Great-great-granddaughter? Richard Dalloway asked himself. Sir Roderick, Sir Miles, Sir Talbot, that was it. It was remarkable how in that family the likeness persisted in the women. She should have been a general of dragoons herself, and Richard would have served under her cheerfully. He had the greatest respect for her. He cherished these romantic views about well-set-up old women of pedigree, and would have liked, in his good-humoured way, to bring some young hotheads of his acquaintance to lunch with her, as if a type like hers could be bred of amiable tea-drinking enthusiasts. He knew her country. He knew her people. There was a vine still bearing which either Lovelace or Herrick, she never read a word of poetry herself, but so the story ran, had sat under. Better wait to put before them the question that bothered her, about making an appeal to the public, if so, in what terms, and so on. Better wait until they have had their coffee, Lady Bruton thought, and so laid the carnations down beside her plate. "How's Clarissa?" she asked abruptly. Clarissa always said that Lady Bruton did not like her. Indeed, Lady Bruton had the reputation of being more interested in politics than people, of talking like a man, of having had a finger in some notorious intrigue of the 80s which was now beginning to be mentioned in memoirs. Certainly there was an alcove in her drawing-room, and a table in that alcove, and a photograph upon that table of General Sir Talbot Moore, now deceased, who had written there, one evening in the 80s, in Lady Bruton's presence, with her cognizance, perhaps advice, a telegram ordering the British troops to advance upon an historical occasion. She kept the pen and told the story. Thus, when she said in her off-hand way, "How's Clarissa?" husbands had difficulty in persuading their wives, and indeed, however devoted, were secretly doubtful themselves of her interest in women who often got in their husbands' way, prevented them from accepting posts abroad, and had to be taken to the seaside in the middle of the session to recover from influenza. Nevertheless, her inquiry, "How's Clarissa?" was known by women infallibly to be a signal from a well-wisher, from an almost silent companion, whose utterances, half a dozen perhaps in the course of a lifetime, signified recognition of some feminine comradeship, which went beneath masculine lunch-parties and united Lady Bruton and Mrs. Dalloway, who seldom met, and appeared when they did meet indifferent and even hostile in a singular bond. "I met Clarissa in the park this morning," said Hugh Whitbread, diving into the casserole, anxious to pay himself this little tribute, for he had only to come to London, and he met everybody at once, but greedy, one of the greediest men she had ever known, Milly Brush thought, who observed men with unflinching rectitude, and was capable of everlasting devotion, to her own sex in particular, being knobbed, scraped, angular, and entirely without feminine charm. "Do you know who's in town?" said Lady Bruton, suddenly bethinking her. "Our old friend Peter Walsh." They all smiled. Peter Walsh! And Mr. Dalloway was genuinely glad, Milly Brush thought, and Mr. Whitbread thought only of his chicken. Peter Walsh! All three, Lady Bruton, Hugh Whitbread, and Richard Dalloway, remembered the same thing. How passionately Peter had been in love, been rejected, gone to India, come a cropper, made a mess of things, and Richard Dalloway had a very great liking for the dear old fellow too. Milly Brush saw that, saw a depth in the brown of his eyes, saw him hesitate, consider, which interested her, as Mr. Dalloway always interested her, for what was he thinking, she wondered, about Peter Walsh? That Peter Walsh had been in love with Clarissa, that he would go back directly after lunch and find Clarissa, that he would tell her, in so many words, that he loved her. Yes, he would say that. Milly Brush once might almost have fallen in love with these silences, and Mr. Dalloway was always so dependable, such a gentleman too. Now being 40, Lady Bruton had only to nod or turn her head a little abruptly, and Millie Brush took the signal, however deeply she might be sunk in these reflections of a detached spirit, of an uncorrupted soul whom life could not bamboozle, because life had not offered her a trinket of the slightest value, not a curl, smile, lip, cheek, nose, nothing whatever. Lady Bruton had only to nod, and Perkins was instructed to quicken the coffee. "Yes, Peter Walsh has come back," said Lady Bruton. It was vaguely flattering to them all. He had come back, battered, unsuccessful, to their secure shores. But to help him, they reflected, was impossible. There was some flaw in his character. Hugh Whitbread said one might, of course, mention his name to so-and-so. He wrinkled lugubriously, consequentially, at the thought of the letters he would write to the heads of government offices about my old friend Peter Walsh, and so on. But it wouldn't lead to anything, not to anything permanent, because of his character. "In trouble with some woman," said Lady Bruton. They had all guessed that that was at the bottom of it. "However," said Lady Bruton, anxious to leave the subject, "we shall hear the whole story from Peter himself." The coffee was very slow in coming. "The address?" murmured Hugh Whitbread, and there was at once a ripple in the grey tide of service which washed round Lady Bruton day in, day out, collecting, intercepting, enveloping her in a fine tissue which broke concussions, mitigated interruptions, and spread round the house in Brook Street, a fine net where things lodged and were picked out accurately, instantly, by grey-haired Perkins, who had been with Lady Bruton these 30 years, and now wrote down the address, handed it to Mr. Whitbread, who took out his pocket-book, raised his eyebrows, and slipping it in among documents of the highest importance, said that he would get Evelyn to ask him to lunch. They were waiting to bring the coffee until Mr. Whitbread had finished. Hugh was very slow, Lady Bruton thought. He was getting fat, she noticed. Richard always kept himself in the pink of condition. She was getting impatient. The whole of her being was setting positively, undeniably, domineeringly brushing aside all this unnecessary trifling. Peter Walsh and his affairs, upon that subject which engaged her attention, and not merely her attention, but that fibre which was the ramrod of her soul, that essential part of her without which Millicent Bruton would not have been Millicent Bruton, that project for emigrating young people of both sexes born of respectable parents and setting them up with a fair prospect of doing well in Canada. She exaggerated. She had perhaps lost her sense of proportion. Emigration was not to others the obvious remedy, the sublime conception. It was not to them, not to Hugh or Richard, or even to devoted Miss Brush, the liberator of the pent egotism, which a strong martial woman, well-nourished, well-descended, of direct impulses, downright feelings, and little introspective power. Broad and simple. Why could not everyone be broad and simple, she asked. Feels rise within her, once youth is past, and must eject upon some object. It may be emigration, it may be emancipation, but whatever it be, this object round which the essence of her soul is daily secreted becomes inevitably prismatic, lustrous, half looking-glass, half precious stone, now carefully hidden in case people should sneer at it, now proudly displayed. Emigration had become, in short, largely Lady Bruton. End of section 17, read by Hannah Dormer, London, 14th of August 2021.